And so blood was delivered to the muscles through the arterial system, and now on its way back, it doesn't have as much power, as much pressure, bringing it back to the heart. So you have to imagine that this sort of functions in like going upwards and then getting stuck, going upwards and getting stuck. So the blood is traveling in little pulses. And so if any of you ever go into emergency settings, if you ever see some arterial bleeds, it'll be just like in movies that you'll see it sort of like a sprinkler, like if you've seen like slasher films, right? Like just spraying all over the wall. Arterial systems have a lot of pressure, so they're sending blood out really fast, like a sprinkler. And then occasionally, sometimes you'll see in movies that they do like a type of cut and blood's coming out like, the best way I can describe it is with a sound like this, like blah, blah, blah. It comes out in little impulses. And that's because it's using, or that's because when you have nicks inside of your vein or your veins are cut, it has sort of a rate to it, like a beat to it. It's traveling in valves. And so when it's bleeding, it bleeds out in little impulses, as opposed to arteries that bleed out really in a very exaggerated, very dramatic manner. And so it relies on skeletal muscle. So this is why at times you also need to be moving around as you're sitting around, listening to your lectures. You need to like squeeze your muscles. You need to contract your muscles because that helps with circulation. That's why it's not healthy to sit for a very long time, because the veins require the skeletal muscles to be contracting. And so sometimes when these valves aren't working properly, they just get larger and larger and more visible. So like, let's say these valves, they're starting to wear out. They're sort of not opening and closing as efficiently. Blood will pool into this space. And so as you get older, you may see something we refer to as varicose veins. And those are those visible veins that typically you can see on the thighs and legs. And they can easily be fixed by, just an injection of fluid, to push any pooling through it. And I don't know how long it lasts, but it's some way you can treat it is to sort of put some fluid in those to sort of push out the fluid that's pulled up in there. And this is something I don't even have a picture to show you, so we can cross this off. Don't have to worry about that yet. And then the last little important fact to add about veins, to sum up our cardiovascular chapter, is that your veins, if you look at this chart, 64% of blood is pooled within just your veins. Just within your veins. If we examine this portion, the pulmonary circuit was the right atria, the right ventricle, and then it goes to the lungs, right? Because the blood cells are going from those chambers to the lungs to get reoxygenated. So you can see that 9% is part of that pulmonary circuit. 7% are going to be located within the heart. So even to clarify this, the only bit that you find in your lungs, actually, let's write these out. Lungs, heart, everything that's only 7% is found in your heart. And this, we got to actually add the vessels. We're going to add the vessels here. Pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins. Okay, the pulmonary circuit. In the heart, the chambers, right atria with its matching left atria. It's right ventricle with the left ventricle. Systemic arterial system. This is going to be everything that's within the arteries, kind of implied there. And then this is the capillaries that are serving all the organs, kind of self-explanatory. The capillaries, these are going to be serving all the organs where the exchange occurs. And then finally, we have our systemic venous, which is all the veins that we learned about, contain 64% of our blood volume. And so they are characterized as being our blood reservoirs. Everything else does not matter. I care for you to know in bold and know this chart here. This is a little bit of extra fun facts to read, but I don't need you to know the exact volume amount and things like that. Just know this chart here. That's all that's missing. Just something I wanted to add before to summarize cardiovascular. All right. And so we're going to get into respiratory system. And again, once we're done with this on Thursday, we'll be finishing this one up. We're going to finish up with the ECG, and that sums up cardiovascular. We'll probably get through a lot of this today. It's not that long. And so, upper respiratory system and lower respiratory system make up the respiratory system. The upper respiratory system is going to be all of these structures involved. Make sure that we know which structures are part of the upper respiratory system and which ones are part of the lower respiratory system. So starting here with the nose, this is considered part of the respiratory system because you can take in air through here. You have little structures in here designed to keep the air that goes into your nasal cavity, to keep it at body temperature, and then to conduct that air into the larynx. And we'll talk about those structures as we go through it. The nasal cavity is the space inside, the nose being the entryway, right, with its openings. We'll discuss that in a second. And the nose is what sticks out. And so the nares or the nostrils are the openings, and they lead into that nasal cavity. We'll discuss some of these structures, which you already even know a little bit of. And then there are also sinuses that we learned about in bones, that there's these spaces that are embedded within the bones as they come together, and those are going to be referred to as sinuses. And more specifically, this word means next to nasals, next to para. Like parallels, a line next to another one, or at least it runs with another one. And so paranasal implies next to the nose. And so these sinuses, as you can see, are next to that nasal cavity. Then we have pharynx, which I would just log this term away now. It's going to come up in digestive again. Just simply means what we commonly call the throat. And we'll break it apart as we get to it. You'll notice that the oral cavity is not really considered part of the respiratory system, even though technically you could breathe in through there, but it's not considered part of the the upper respiratory system. And as we progress into our lower respiratory system, this becomes one of the most crucial facts that you have to just start logging away, is how are things organized as they're entering our bodies from the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. If we look at the nasal cavity, air is the main purpose here. None of us are consuming food through our nose. That should be like self-explanatory, that this is where where air is coming through the nasal cavity, and air is going to travel down our pharynx, which is the throat region. And then it has two options. It can either go to the forward compartment, the forward tube, the tube in the front, the anterior tube, or it'll travel in the posterior tube. And so the one we care about today is going to be the larynx. This is what we just commonly call the windpipe, but in anatomy we call it the larynx. And so air is going to traverse through this larynx, which is going to be this initial portion here, the larynx. And then it's going to travel down this tube, this hollow tube, which is going to be your trachea. And so air is traveling through here. But you need to have two stories in your head. Your body cares about gas exchange, so gas needs to enter that windpipe, the larynx. And gas doesn't care about going to our esophagus, which is this tube in the back, posterior to the larynx and the trachea. And this esophagus cares about food. It's going to send food all the way down into your stomach. And so one of the beginning things that you need to begin to start training your eyes to see is that there's a direction forward into the larynx and a direction backwards into the esophagus. And so we have our trachea, which is going to lead into exchange sites at the very end. If we follow like the goal of gas here is that gas still is not being placed into our capillaries yet, into our blood vessels at all traveling through here. But it has to reach these very ends here. The very ends of this tree here is going to be where all the exchange occurs, because we're going to have these alveoli at the very ends here. At the very end. And so gas, its goal is to make it to the very end so that it can be exchanged into the capillaries. And we'll see how that occurs in a little bit. So everything that follows is just how does that gas get all the way to those tips? And so from the trachea, as we're traversing in an inferior direction as gas, you encounter the bronchus. The bronchus is going to be a branch that's finally going to penetrate into the lungs. And so the bronchus is that first initial segment, the larger tubes. And then as we get very, very small, we'll see terms like bronchioles implying smaller tubes. Smaller tubes. So you can see it's a play off of the same word. It's just the IOLES, just like arterioles and artery. That arterioles was a smaller version of an artery. Bronchioles are a smaller version of the bronchus. And so you can see that bronchioles are going to be different segments, like terminal bronchioles, and then respiratory bronchioles, and then just like those are the ones I think you need to know. So bronchioles just means the tinier branches, and we'll give them very specific names as we get there. But this becomes the themes: bronchus, bronchioles, and then finally we made it to the tubes that connect to the alveoli. Those are our respiratory bronchioles, the very last bit, the little last bit of the journey that oxygen needs to travel through. And never forget, as you're breathing in oxygen going into the lungs, you are also breathing out CO2. So even from here in our alveoli, CO2 travels out, out. And then when you exhale, you breathe out. You should be breathing it through your nose, or you can possibly breathe it out through your mouth. And so CO2 is exiting, oxygen is entering. And so starting with our nose, you have the dorsum of the nose. You have the cartilages that make up that last inferior portion of the nose. This last part is made out of cartilage. And that's why in all your skeletal models that you saw, do you remember you typically see that opening that you can see inside the nose? And that's because the cartilage was not preserved for you on those skeletal models. And some of them most of them did have their actual dorsum of the nose, the bone that's right superior to that opening that you can see inside. And then so our nostrils are going to be those openings, and that's also interchangeable with the word nares, external nares. If you are outside and you look at it, external nares. If you are looking at it from the inside, internal nares. But you don't need to know that fact. External nares is good enough. And we'll come back to this little fact after we've gone through the entire set of lungs. And so, along the way, a lot of this is going to sound like a refresher. And so if you have falsely stacked cells, what did we used to call those cells? Pseudostratified columnar epithelia. And so you can see that you're going to encounter that epithelial tissue on the inner lining of that pathway. And the purpose of it with its assisted cells, what are the cells that are embedded in between that secrete mucus? Goblet cells. And when they secrete their mucus onto the apical side, what structure is going to be responsible for moving mucus? Cilia. What's the other one not shown here that's involved in absorption? Microvilli. And so those cilia, they together with the goblet cells and the pseudostratified epithelia, what they create is your mucociliary escalator, which is just simply the movement of the mucus towards the outside of the air system. In other words, as things are coming into your trachea, these tissues are pushing all things that you do not need, whether it's little trapped pathogens or just trapped little debris from breathing, and the mucus is sending it out of your larynx, and then sending it into your esophagus so you can swallow it, and then you can poop it out, to keep it simple. You can just defecate it out. So your body's always getting rid of anything that comes in through the process of breathing. Now, one thing to add here. When we discuss this word mucosa, this word is going to be a common theme when we get to digestive, and this is a nice picture to show all the layers. What do we call the family of tissues that's on the most apical side in contact with the lumen? What's the family of tissue? We know the name of it, pseudostratified epithelial tissue. So what type of tissue is this? Epithelial. And then what was that membrane we have here? And then what was the type of tissue we encounter here? Connective tissue. And so whenever you are referring to just the epithelial tissue, we shorthand it and we call it mucus layer, right? Doesn't it kind of make sense? The mucosa layer, written like this, mucosa. This is going to come up over and over again. So log it away today that the segment that's in contact, or that's going to be where the mucus is called your mucosa. And so to adapt the term now, this is the perfect picture to show, to tie in all our epithelials. Let's recap just a little bit. Here you can see pseudostratified columnar epithelia in your nasal cavity. In your nasal cavity. And that same oxygen, if we're traveling down and we magic school bus and become really tiny like a little oxygen molecule, as we traverse into the throat area, we've now made it there. You no longer have this as the inner lining. You now have stratified squamous epithelia. And what was this tissue particularly good at? Not gas exchange, not absorption. I like where your head's at. You're thinking about the simple. You've all described simple. But what about stratified? Protection. Protection from friction. I think some of you might have said it, but protection from friction. So doesn't it make sense that in our pharynx, in our throat area, that we're going to have a type of tissue that protects from friction? Because what's always occurring? What's always going through here? Food. And so every day, some of us are consuming 3 or 4 times, like 4 times a day. So here, right, you're like losing these cells, you're swallowing the cells, and your body is recycling those cells, and they're just responsible for making more and more and more. And so now we are going into the larynx, not the esophagus, because the esophagus will have something different. But in here, we have our respiratory mucosa, which is going to be the same thing that we encountered in the nasal cavity, which was our pseudostratified columnar epithelia, or this same tissue here, which is written here for you. Pseudostratified columnar epithelia with cilia. And don't forget about our embedded mucus cells, which are goblet cells. And so the last thing to add here is that when we looked at the skin, we saw that in our dermis area, where there was connective tissue, that we had glands. This, either whether they were eccrine glands, apocrine glands, sweat glands, or the oil glands, they were embedded in the connective tissue layer. And so you have mucus glands. So on top of the goblet cells producing mucus, you also have mucus glands that create that very mucus. And so to sum up that little image, that everything that we discussed regarding the movement of mucus is called, again, the mucociliary escalator. And it's just about the flow of trapped debris or pathogens, possibly. The mucus is produced by both goblet cells and also by mucus glands that are embedded in the connective tissue layer. And the cilia are responsible for beating and moving that mucus. And then they are either swallowed, or some of us might actually spit it out, right? It really depends. That's why it has this little term here, coughed out. And the acids in your stomach will destroy anything that goes through there. This last note, any single cells that are replaced like these on the surface, they will be replaced by the stem cell population that exists closer to the basement membrane that will eventually divide into or mature into a proper pseudo stratified columnar cell. All right, anything I've missed here? Nope. All right, and let's keep it going. And so as we go down through, we've already progressed through here, right? We're no longer going to have our little goblet cells. We're not really seeing those when we arrive to the very end. And so at the very end, you can see that this epithelial transitioned into cuboidal epithelial. And then finally, at the very end, you all knew that the simple squamous was great at, what was it again? Gas exchange. So doesn't it make sense that we're going to need that tissue that's great at gas exchange at the very end where the gas exchange occurs? And so if we go back to our nasal cavity, this is a structure that you've already seen. What does this look like in general? I know it's written there for you now, but what is this? It's your eye. Inside here is your nasal cavity. And so do you remember your inferior nasal concha and your middle nasal concha? This one's new. You didn't have this one in your lab. But these are going to be the grooves that you can see. If you make a frontal section, meaning that if you look at my head now and then you slice it like this, you have two halves, right? This half on this side, the anterior, and then the posterior. If you were to take this side off, you'd be staring at the inside of my skull, and that's what you're seeing there. And so this nasal cavity, what it does is that it's actually creating all these grooves that have all these inner blood vessels that are humidifying and keeping that air at body temperature so that as you breathe in, by the time the air has reached your lungs, it has now become body temperature. And so that's what these grooves are. It's sort of a way of circulating that air and conditioning the air. That's what we refer to it as. And so this here warms and humidifies air, conditions air, conditions incoming gas. And not just that, within those nasal cavities or within all these nasal grooves, before we give them names, within all these grooves, there's going to be also nerve cells or olfactory receptors, which are embedded with the epithelial cells that are responsible for smell. We'll learn this We'll learn this very closely when we get into smell or senses. And not just that, it also traps small particles. And keep in mind that we saw in our previous page that we have cilia, we have goblet cells, just like we do in the larynx, in that nasal area. So you can see that we also have a mucociliary apparatus, that functionality within our nasal cavity, trapping debris and making sure. Have any of you ever been to like a deserty area and you're there for a very long time, and after the whole day of being there, like you go maybe take a shower and you blow your nose and there's just dirt stuck in that mucus? That's what's sort of what we mean by it's capable of trapping particles. You don't really want all that sand going into your nasal into your lungs. And so, very simply, the words are easy to remember because you might have this one already sort of hidden inside of your brains. It's like middle nasal concha, inferior nasal concha, and those are going to be the elevation, the bone part. If we look at these bodies, right, you can see here you have a concha, the bone part, the solid bone. And then the grooves inside, meatus. So the word meatus to us means the grooves. So the actual bone itself is the meatus, and very simply superior, middle, and inferior, the bone component. and then the groove in between meatus, and then you just got to add the superior, middle, and inferior. All right, so that becomes pretty easy. Our paranasal sinus. This is not my favorite picture, but remember in the frontal bone, we had a little cavern inside of that frontal bone. We had one embedded within the ethmoid bone, and we also have one in the maxillary bone, that when all the bones unite inside of our skull, there's these little pockets of just empty space. We refer to those as paranasal sinus. And this is not the best picture for it, but otherwise, we just need to know what these sinuses are there for. And so mucus secreted by the sinuses, they moisten and clean the nasal cavity. Not just that, they also drain tears, meaning that when you cry, I know that we don't know this just yet, but at the very top of your eye, tears actually go in this direction. They travel, and we knew this little bone here we used to nickname it the crying bone. What is it called? The lacrimal bone. And what did it have inside of it? The lacrimal canal, the lacrimal groove, right? That little opening, that's a drain, like the sink. Like when you have a sink and you turn the water on your sink and it goes down the drain, that's the drain, that little opening. So when tears fall, they fall from this direction, fall, and like a sink, they drain through there. And so when they go in through that little cavity, they then will go into your sinuses, and then eventually you will drain them from your nose, out of your nose. So that's why what happens when we're really crying? What's coming out of our nose? A little bit of mucus, and it's because your tears are pooling. Some of them might come out of here, right? You're crying, but some of them go into that little sink, which right now that's all we're going to call it, the little drain in the lacrimal bone. Goes, and it goes into your nasal cavity, and that's why you have mucus when you're crying. And it's because you're draining tears from your nose. So your nose is sort of like the sink in a way for tears, which is kind of interesting, right? Yes. They start from something we call the lacrimal gland. Each one of your eyes, I know that we don't know this yet, but each one of these eyes, right, they have a little gland that sits right on top of the eye, right on top. And so tears travel in that direction, moistening the eye in day-to-day function. And when you cry as well, they release stored tears, and then they come down the drain. So they're located, if I'm pointing it, right about here. On both eyes. Lacrimal gland. And then next, nasal septum. Now, this was a little bit of a tough thing to actually learn when we were doing our bone exam, because when we looked down the nasal cavity, we had a structure that just came straight down, and we really had trouble, right, learning what's the top one and what's the bottom one. And so that top half was your perpendicular plate, as you're seeing here, perpendicular plate. And then the bottom bone, that's a little tiny bone on the inferior part of that nasal cavity, was the vomer. So we were always saying in our anatomy lab exams that the top half was perpendicular plate and the bottom half was the vomer. And together they create the nasal septum. And what a septum is, just generally speaking, is that as you see my nose right now as I do this, right? I hope I don't have any boogers in my nose, but if you look at this, you see this break here that separates my left nostril and my right nostril? That's a septum. So if you just look at a nasal cavity, you have a separation of the left side and the right side. And that's what this image is really trying to make, a perfect image to understand, is that you can see that this is dividing the nose into a left and a right. So a septum, you still have a division between the two. And that's why when you hear about a deviated septum, it's because that septum is no longer like in its proper orientation, but it's deviated, meaning might be bent like this. So you might be having better breathing or excessive breathing from one nostril, and one nostril is just completely blocked off all the time. And so a deviated septum can be caused by physical injury or excessive drug use like cocaine. Say one more time. That's the bone being bent, and any tissues associated on the surface of those bones.
So you know how you have a little soft spot?
The soft spot is skin,
Yeah.
and remember that this half has cartilage. So the septum in this segment is made of skin and cartilage,
Yeah.
and then
Like the hard spot right above that, that's the bone?
yes, and then if you actually, I don't want you all to do this right now, but if you go into your nose, if you pick your nose and then you look at you put your fingers in both of them, and then you make them look at each other, then you'd be touching the septum. That's what it is.
I've seen people get it pierced and the piercer pierces.
That's gonna go through your skin
No, I
and
know that,
your
but I've seen
cartilage.
people like accidentally go too far past and pierce like the hard spot.
Ouch.
So is that the bone?
Yeah, well, I think that that's not really possible without some. You're gonna get an infection with something like that because
Well, I
if
know
it,
they take it out right
if it
away,
goes
they
through the
take it out.
bone, that's crazy. That's why I think they pull it out. I've never seen it myself, but I imagine it's just like the ear that they pull, and I think it's the same thing. They pull it down and then they give you your bull ring, right? That's what
Yeah,
it.
'cause I have that done, they pull it down, but I've seen some people.
Yeah, they got to make sure not to nick the bone, the perpendicular plate, and the vomer. But the septum, that this little bottom part can be made out of skin, mostly skin on that bottom end. So what we're seeing inside is much more deeper into your nasal cavity, which is your bone, most of your bone. All right, we'll call it here.